I remember one time I was called in for jury duty and was selected as part of the panel brought into the courtroom for a murder trial. And there were questionnaires and some questions, and I was part of a group of people dismissed without explanation. And most of us were feeling relieved as we headed down in the elevator, but there was a woman who looked dejected, and she said, "You know, they never choose me. Am I not good enough?" And she was sincere. Have you ever heard about a party that was held that you thought you should have been invited to and you weren't? Ever been in a classroom with your hand raised and that teacher always calls on those other people? Ever remember as a child, or some of you who are still there right now, when there's a lineup of the kids on the playground and the teacher selects the 2 team captains and they start choosing up the people for kickball. And there's always those same kids always chosen first. Have you ever been someone in the middle or at the end of that choosing, the public revealing of where you are in the pecking order? Have you ever had someone say no to your invitation about anything? Ever had someone divorce you, lay you off, give you a bad performance review? You can't make it very far in this life without some messages that have come at us that say, "You're not good enough." Messages that say we're in some way or some capacity unworthy or less than. It's just part of what it means to be in this world. They come at us, and likely they seep in or sink in, and then we do different things with them. Some people kind of surrender to them, really trust that I'm just not good enough, and that's the mode of operation in the world. Other people, maybe it's gotten in there, but their response to it, maybe the other end of the spectrum, is to say, "I'm fighting this. I'm going to show you how good I am. I'm competent and capable, and people like me." Whatever the response is, those voices are there. And they can trip us up, especially if we're not conscious of them. And because of that universality of experience, it's probably no surprise that even some of the, what we might say, the chief characters in biblical stories wrestle with those same voices as well. So the first reading you heard about Isaiah, it's a bit resonant with the Jeremiah passage from last week, and a reminder that prophets in Israel, it doesn't mean they're fortune tellers, because I know sometimes we hear prophet like they tell the future. More simply, prophets are people who have in some way, shape, or form decided to listen for how God is still speaking. And that then usually, as the stories unfold, God says, "Thank you for tuning in. There are lots of people who aren't listening, and it's making a mess of things. Could you talk to them for me and get them to turn around and be part of what I'm doing?" So Isaiah is one of these prophets, and often that involved then lots of listening, probably meditation, contemplation, and likely what we're to imagine as the scene opens is that Isaiah is in a meditative state and he's having a vision of God, and the sense of God filling, and the train of the robes, and the seraphs. By the way, did you catch how many wings? 6. That's freaky, right? The medieval artists kind of cleaned up angels and seraphs, but it's this potent, powerful vision, something overwhelming, just great power. And Isaiah's response isn't just awe. Part of his response is he feels shame. I am unworthy to be in the face of all of this goodness. To paraphrase, he says, I'm a messed up guy and I come from messed up people. Who am I to be in the presence of such overwhelming goodness and beauty and greatness? And I think it's really helpful that Isaiah names these things. Because I suppose there could have been all right, we're going to turn this off now. Time to binge watch the next series on Netflix. And just push it away, push it down. I understand there was no Netflix then, But right, the thing to, like, I feel unworthy, and then I can't say it, I don't want to speak it, I'm embarrassed, and so let's just turn this off and move on to other things. But what Isaiah does is he says it. He confesses it right there. I feel unworthy, I'm not good enough. Which then always, in these stories, invites opportunity for dialogue. And what happens as the vision continues is one of the emissaries of the divine comes and essentially says, listen, God makes you good enough. Yep, messed up person, messed up people, aren't we all? But there's forgiveness, there's restoration, there's healing. You are, after all, in the very image of God. You are good enough. Not only good enough to experience God's goodness and glory and love and life, but good enough to bring it to others. And Isaiah then says, all right, here I am. Send me. He begins to trust the one who thought he wasn't good enough. He begins to trust that he is. 500 years later, we've got Peter wrestling with those same kind of voices. Peter, who Jesus will say in one gospel, this is the rock I'm going to build my whole called out new community on. Peter, whom the Roman Catholic Church says is the beginning of the line of infallible popes, which probably would shock Peter because he doesn't see himself that way, as is revealed in the story. And Peter, I will say, is more often in the stories, I think he has those I'm not good enough voices. How he responds isn't, oh, I'm not good enough usually, but more of a puffs himself up. The response to those voices, I'll prove how good I am, and he kind of blunders and stumbles and charges ahead. But not in this story today. So in the story today, Peter, and it's revealed as the story is unfolding, but Peter has spent the night fishing and had a very unsuccessful night shift. Didn't catch a thing. Anyone ever gone fishing and not caught anything? Right. So I did have, though, in a church I served in New England, a retired fisherman from Marblehead, Massachusetts, who offered a new line on this story. He goes, yeah, you're all disappointed. When it's your livelihood, it's terrifying. When we would be out there and put all those resources in and came back with nothing, you wonder, how am I going to feed my family? How am I going to pay the bills? This is where Peter's at that morning. Well, what can you do? Clean out the nets, put things away, probably just wants to go to sleep, and hopefully the next shift will be better. But he's likely feeling not only disappointment, but a sense of failure. Not just for himself, but the people who are counting on him. And then along the beach comes Jesus with his now ubiquitous group of people kind of hanging on his words. And Jesus says to Peter, hey, climbs in his boat and like, can you just push off a little bit? And we don't hear a conversation there, but I'm imagining Peter at least an internal eye roll. What? I just want to go to bed. You don't understand, this has been terrible. But what we do see Peter do often is what Jesus asks him to do. So regardless of his doubts or his fears, he leans into what he's called to do. So Jesus gets in the boat, pushes out a little, and then Jesus takes advantage of these superior acoustics. I remember spending a week with my grandparents on this little campground on a lake in northern Michigan, and you could hear every word of the people around the lake, and they didn't know it. It was a fun eavesdropping experiment. So if you haven't been in those settings, the acoustics are great, so it's a way that Jesus can reach more of the crowd. And we're not told by our gospel author what Jesus teaches specifically, but when we read the Gospels, we see he's pretty on point. So he probably is saying something about the reign of God is at hand and calling people to turn away from the powers of fear and scarcity and self-serving that reign in them and turn and be immersed or baptized in God's Spirit to then embody the reign of justice, mercy, love. And he tells examples and stories and uses images and parables. So even though Peter is exhausted, tired, maybe just wants to sleep, he is on the receiving end himself in the boat of all of that teaching. And then when Jesus wraps it up, he says to Peter, let's push out deeper into the water and go fishing again. This time, we hear what Peter has to say, because Jesus is not a fisherman. So Peter's the expert. He already feels like he failed last night, And that was the right time to go fishing. This isn't even the right time to go fishing. So there's this resistance. And have you ever, you failed at something and someone invites you to do it again? Like, who needs that humiliation? Right? That can sometimes be our response. So Peter does say it. Listen, Master, we already fished all night and didn't catch a thing. But then again, to his credit, he leans into what Jesus asked him to do. But all right, if you say so, off we go. It could have had a tone to it, though, a little like, if you say so. I don't know. But he does it, right? And that matters. So they push out, and Peter lowers the net, and we hear in the story, not only do they catch something, it's so many fish, they have to call in backup. The other boat, come on, we need your help to pull all this in. And in the face of this overwhelming catch, this abundance, this incredible gift that has occurred, Peter's response isn't just awe or gratitude. Like Isaiah, there's a sense of shame, unworthiness. He says, go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man. It's a lot like Isaiah. I'm a messed up person from messed up people. Go away from me. I am not worthy of this. But like Isaiah, Peter names it. He doesn't shove it down or hide it. He speaks it, which invites a response, which from Jesus is, don't be afraid. That Jesus is letting him know, you are worthy of this. And it's the sense is like with Isaiah, God's going to make you worthy, not only to receive the fullness, not only to receive generosity, receive grace, receive mercy, but you're good enough to carry it to others. You're going to be fishing for people, he says. You're good enough to bring it to others. These stories, I think, are told and written down and repeated and studied because they do speak to that pretty universal experience that all of us, if we make it any distance in life, we have taken in and heard voices that told us in one way or another, you are not good enough. And then though we hear these stories that say, the God of all the universe wants to love you and pour out healing and grace and mercy on you. What? How? Me? What? How can that be? And furthermore, we might also hear, God thinks that you can do God's transformational work in the world. Huh? Me? I'm not good enough. And these are stories that say, well, name it, pray it, speak it to God, to trusted people, so that we can be open to hearing the truth that God makes us good enough. That there is healing and redemption and forgiveness and grace, transformation that is offered to us, and then transformation that can be lived through us. I was remembering something from a long time ago for me, and I know some of you are like, oh, it wasn't that long ago, young pastor. I'm not that young. I was 23, and at the age of 23, I'm in seminary, and I was invited to be one of 4 preachers for the Indianapolis Multicultural Youth Revival. It was to be held in a large, historically African-American church, and the idea, and it came from some of my fellow students, was to bring together different church backgrounds, racial groups, etc., to be in the spirit, to be connected, to see what brings us together, and to be revived. Well, I knew I was supposed to be learning things and say yes to things, but I had some hesitancy. So 2 of the people who'd be preaching were, unlike me, I went from undergrad to seminary, which at the time I was doing that was a rare thing. Most people were coming from 2nd or 3rd careers, and then they were going to seminary. So 2 of the preachers, African American, older than me, and although they were in seminary, they had lots of experience preaching. And then there was a Latina youth minister who had also had experience preaching. And then there was me, 23-year-old from a white church in the suburbs, UCC. I'd preached once for a class. Furthermore, in my church background and experience, we did not have revivals. All right, in my church tradition, revival was like you pulled a few more stops out on the organ. Or there was a really good dessert at the potluck. So I was very nervous, but I said yes. I knew I was supposed to trust and lean in, being Peter-like in that moment. Well, the day had come where I was to be one of the preachers. One person that already preached had done an amazing job. A choir was singing, and I was standing, waiting to go up on this platform. This is a church that had held 1,000 people, and it was full of teenagers and the adults who were with them. And also, I was doing youth ministry at the time. I was like, not only are you preaching, you're trying to hold the attention of teenagers. So I'm standing there, and one of the members, an elder of the church, grandmother age, she looks at me, and she has these, she stands just so straight, and she had this beautiful hat and white gloves. Her job was to make sure people got where they needed to go. And she looks at me, and she smiles at me, and she said, "You're nervous, aren't you?" I said, "Oh, yes. I can see it." She said, "I'm thinking some part of you thinks you may not be good enough to do this." She had my number. I nodded. And she looked me in the eye, and she said, "Sweetheart, God makes you good enough. You belong to God. You belong to the Lord. The Spirit is with you. I'm going to pray that you know it and feel it. God makes you good enough. So go up there and get him." And I went up there, and I have no idea what the content of my sermon is looking back. That's a long time ago. But I do remember, even in the moment, unlike the churches of my own growing up and experience, the sermon was much more, I'll call it dialogical. Right? I'm preaching, and there's amens, and I did not feel alone. There were people with me in it, and there was a sense of being carried in it. And then once it was over and I'm walking back down, that woman is still there with her gloves and her hat, and she smiles at me and she says, "You are anointed of God. I told you, God makes you good enough. Don't you forget it. Keep praying it until you trust it." So I know most of us were not going to preach a revival. I may never do that again. But I share that story because all of us have gifts to share. All of us have ways that we can embody more of God's justice, healing, hope, and love. And we can get tripped up by the voices at work in us, whether they show up as low self-esteem or incredible arrogance. But we all have the voices. And that we can, like Isaiah, like Peter, confess them, name them. There's days I just don't feel good enough, or I'm wondering if I'm worthy of this. And the more that we name that, the more that we open ourselves to hear the truth, where God can say to us, "I make you good enough. You belong to me. I offer healing and forgiveness and strength." And then as you carry that into the world, well, you help others know their belovedness. You help others know that they're good enough to be part of what God is doing in the world. And then the gift keeps on giving. We can say, "Here I am, Lord," and be part of what God is doing. Praise God. Amen.